Movie Buff Specialist Phil and John are back with episode number 98 as we continue counting down our favorite 100 movies of all time. It's number three. John. We have somehow made it to number three, and we're going to have a huge uptick in viewers because people are going to be expecting the Survivor recap, which really cracks me up. That's going to be coming in about an hour 15, although Survivor did end with a pretty epic Robert De Niro impression tonight. So there you go. It ties in a little bit, but I just figured I had to throw that in. But we're talking Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind and Vertigo over here. And then we're going to hop over and talk about Survivor. So if you're looking for Survivor, wait an hour and 15 minutes. And if you're a movie fan who doesn't actually watch our Survivor show, well, now you know that a lot of people are really confused right now as to why we're doing this. But Alexa was running a little bit behind or not. This was planned. So we knew we weren't going to do it right away. But anyway, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind and Vertigo. John, we only have 3 weeks left, counting tonight. So there's only 2 episodes left after this. I know we say it like every week. It's shocking that we made it this far. It's shocking that we made it this far. But there was something about writing number 3 in episode 98 that just really brought this home, because next week is the penultimate episode, and then it's the final episode. And the fact that we somehow, over all of this, sync this up also with the end of the Survivor season, so that like these are both ending at the same time, even though this was a 2.5-year thing, is pretty incredible. I gotta say, it's pretty damn incredible. So here we are. I'm really excited to talk about both of these movies. Vertigo from 1958, Eternal Sunshine from 2004. They're the only ones that you're going to find. If you look up Vertigo of any other type, they're all like these crappy direct DVD videos. But John, how's life going? What's up?
I mean, life's great. Life's great. What are you talking about? We're in our final 3. I mean, even though my movie watching has gone substantially down recently, I'm at least watching 2 absolutely phenomenal films every week, because we have some great ones. And this week is definitely no exception, because this week I think we're at the point where it really feels like we take another jump. You mentioned it. You texted me about it earlier this week, that like there's a jump between 4 and 3. And I felt that watching these movies this week.
Yeah, it was weird for me because Amelie used to be my number 3. And then Eternal Sunshine was further down. And the more I've like grown up, Eternal Sunshine jumped it. And I really like Amelie, I might drop to like 5, 6, 7, like somewhere in that range. Like I might drop it behind Moonrise, maybe The Graduate, but I wouldn't drop it any further than that. So like that's how good I think this movie is. But the way I felt at the end of Eternal Sunshine, I'm very excited to watch American Beauty and The Deer Hunter, because if I still feel the same way after those 2 movies, that's going to be amazing. If I don't, then I have the wrong number 1 movie of all time, because it should be Eternal Sunshine. So I felt like there was just something different about Eternal Sunshine. And I'm really excited to talk about Vertigo, because I like Vertigo so much, except for the one damn scene, which I'm going to break down in graphic detail here, because it is a murder and it is brutal and I hate it. And it's really what has kept that movie. Every time I see it come up as like the best Hitchcock, or in like it was the number 1 movie of all time by BFI at one point. I believe it was BFI, or maybe it was Sight and Sound, or maybe that's the same thing.
Those are the same thing.
There you go. So they had it at number 1, surpassing Citizen Kane. And when I sat down and watched it, I was like, oh, this is great. And then that one scene happens. But we'll talk about all of that when we get there. We are going to start with Vertigo, so I'll let you talk first. So go ahead. Give me Vertigo.
So the thing with Vertigo was, I like to call it like my re-entry into my love for film. Like I always knew I loved movies. I always knew I enjoyed watching weird movies and classic movies and all types of movies. But I've talked about it before on the podcast. There was a time in my life where I lived in the middle of nowhere. And while I lived in the middle of nowhere, I didn't watch as many movies. And one time my mother came up and visited me, and we couldn't really go outside because there were a bunch of grizzly bears everywhere. So we sat down and we're like, okay, let's watch a movie. And I was like, okay, let's watch Vertigo. I've never seen it before. I've heard it's great. It's it's BFI's number 1 movie. Let's check it out. And I fell in love with it. I was like, wow, how have I gone so long without watching movies? This is Hitchcock. I think Hitchcock at his finest. Yes, I know we have that one scene you're going to talk about that can ruin the movie for a lot of people. But I think this is a movie that's so eloquently done. And I know there are a lot of other things in Vertigo that some people have gripe with. I know a lot of people don't really like Jimmy Stewart all that much. I know Hitchcock himself.
Who doesn't like Jimmy Stewart? Wait, why?
I know people. I know people who really don't like Jimmy Stewart.
You should stop talking to those people immediately. But anyway, continue. Sorry, I couldn't help interjecting.
But Hitchcock blamed Jimmy Stewart for not being like young enough to appeal to a wider audience as to why
Mhm.
Vertigo didn't do well when it came out 65 years ago. Yesterday,
Yeah.
somehow, with the way that this list ended up, with the episodes we've had to skip and the episodes like other things we've added in, we are talking about Vertigo on the 65th anniversary of it coming out, and it's just I think Hitchcock does. He takes what he did with Psycho and with other films like Rear Window and Rope and all of these movies that have like all this tension. He lays a story. I think this is some of the best setup. I do think this is the best setup we have in any like film noir film. The setup in this movie is spectacular. It's so well constructed. It has one of the greatest payoffs. And then it's so haunting in the ending. It's beautifully shot. It's incredibly acted. I just think this is a damn near perfect movie.
Yeah. So I will agree with you in terms of setup for a film noir. I couldn't agree more. Every time I rewatch this movie, the first hour and a half, I'm like, damn, this movie is so good. And I love Jimmy Stewart. Those people who don't like Jimmy Stewart are crazy. Obviously, for anybody who doesn't really know Hitchcock's like years here, he did Rear Window, then Vertigo, and then Vertigo was in there, North by Northwest. And then because he had stopped kind of making horror movies and like these macabre movies, that's why he made Psycho. Psycho was an answer to prove that he could still make those types of movies. So Psycho coming out in 1960, it always blows my mind that it's older than, or that it's newer than Vertigo and Rear Window and North by Northwest, because it feels like the classic Hitchcock, but it was Hitchcock really showing. I cannot forgive this scene. I literally can't forgive it. And the problem is, John, when you think about the plot of this movie, this is a perfectly plotted movie. It is a perfectly plotted movie. We start off with him letting the guy die because he has the vertigo incident. He gets injured. He comes back. His friend asks him to follow around his wife, who is not who she said it's disappearing, whatever. And he starts to really buy into it because he doesn't really know what the wife looks like, right? Like, so he starts to really buy into it. And then they take him. She talks about the bell tower. And we have this perfect setup where the woman is thrown off the bell tower. And it is one of the great reveals in film history. Like, it is legitimately one of the best reveals in film history. When Jimmy Stewart starts following around whatever her name is, and it's Kim Novak in my eyes, starts following around Kim Novak when she has the brunette hair. And you're like, is it her? Is it not? Because honestly, it doesn't look that much like Kim Novak. Like, it doesn't look like
that. The hair and makeup do such a great job of obscuring her just enough to make you question if it's her or not.
So you're questioning it, and then you get that brilliant reveal. It is one of the great reveals in film history, one of the greatest twists ever. Up till that moment, might have been the greatest twist ever. I know you had things like the Maltese Falcon and Dr. Caligari and all that, but in terms of like the way this was set up, this is a oh my god moment. Like, your jaw hits the floor. And they weren't making movies like this in the early 50s. Late, like early 40s with film noir, they would try, but a lot of times it's so forced. You could see what was coming, whatever. You do not see this coming because it's not established that there could ever potentially be a second woman. However, unlike in what I believe is a crap movie like The Prestige, where it is literally never established and it just turns into a bunch of nonsense, this leaves it open to believability. We're like, wow, that makes a whole lot of sense. And then that leads into what I think is one of the worst scenes ever put in a great movie. And the reason why I hate it so much more, John, is because it ruins the real moments of those reveals later on. And without that scene, this is a perfect movie. In my eyes, without this scene, this is in my top 100. This might be my favorite Hitchcock. This is legitimately maybe a top 10 movie for me. But because of that scene, it butchers the last 30 minutes because everything that is revealed after that point, we already know because of this horrible, lazy written note that she narrates to us as she's writing it to him to give us all the details that we're going to get anyway, just to rip it up and throw it in the trash, and he never gets it. It's so bad. And I get like being able to look past it because of what the rest of the movie is, and it might not bother you as much as it bothers me. I don't think it bothers anybody as much as it bothers me. But it's how I always give Citizen Kane a lot of shit because people say, Rosebud. It's the greatest
Yeah.
line ever, blah, blah, blah. The premise of that movie is that he died alone and no one was there. And we have visual proof that when he whispers Rosebud, barely audible, even when there's an extreme close-up on his lips, that there is nobody in that room, and the nurse walks in and opens the door, and because she hears the crash of the glass on the ground. But the whole premise of that movie is, what does Rosebud mean? Who the hell heard it? I can't help it. Like, if you're gonna be the greatest movie of all time, you can't have things like that. And like we watched Casablanca. Casablanca doesn't have that. The Godfather doesn't have that. And that's why when people are saying, what's the greatest American movie ever made? I always go to those two over a Vertigo or a Citizen Kane. And I still understand the greatness of these movies. It just frustrates me so much because every time I watch Vertigo, I'm like, maybe it won't be as bad this time. And then it pisses me off so much that I had to pause the movie to turn to Rachel and say, I hate this scene so much after it happened.
I was really glad that you had expressed your feelings about that scene to me prior to me watching it this week, because then it really let me look at that scene in a lot more of an analytical way this time. Not so much as like, why is this bad? Why is this happening? But more of a, why is this happening? Like, what is the purpose of this scene? I think it's really important because at this point where Scotty is so emotionally and mentally damaged, like he is going through psychosis, he is just completely left out of the world at this point, obsessed with this woman that he fell in love with, who he blames himself for her dying. And at that moment, I think what's so important about that scene and why it's included in this movie is because it's our perspective change in the film. Everything from that point has been Scotty's perspective. This is our perspective shift to Judy, understanding that, yeah, okay, is like her reading out this letter kind of bad? Yeah, it is. It would be inexcusable for me not to admit that. But what it does is it tells us this character genuinely also fell in love with him. And despite the fact that he is still so obsessed with this person who doesn't actually exist, she loves him so much, she is willing to do whatever it takes to stay with him, despite all of her best judgment.
Yeah. And guess what? We see that over the next 10 minutes of the movie. So that's why I don't need it. We see it. And like, I get it's a different audience, right? Like, it's 1958. Yeah. They'd never seen something like this. We're talking about this movie 65 years later, where we didn't know what the medium of film was going to become. I mean, you have to think 25 years ago or 24 years ago right now, it was American Beauty won Best Picture, right? And that's the movie I'm going to be talking about next week. 24 years before Vertigo, it was, I think It Happened One Night or something along those lines. I mean, I watched The Informer this week. That was 1935. Think about the growth of film during that period. You didn't know what audiences were truly going to be looking for. And the reason I make that comparison is because 24 years ago, film hasn't changed all that much. Really, the only thing that's changed is the addition of special effects, a lot more special effects. Those are the big changes. But ultimately, what makes a story, what we love in a story is the same. That's not the case when you're going from 1934 to 1958. So we're still in the baby stages of film in 1958. So maybe that's why that's there. But watching it as a modern audience, this is a hard movie for me to show somebody and say, this is the best Hitchcock movie. Because when that scene happens, it's hard to justify. It's hard to defend it. And I know you just like sat there and said it, but the rebuttal is so simple because it's like, but everything that happens after that, we get that she loves him so much because it's kind of creepy how everything goes down after that. And it's not creepy in a way that this movie doesn't age well because it's very purposeful. Yeah. But it's creepy. And that unsettling issue that's going on there is kind of lessened because of that scene. And I don't want to just harp on this scene. So we'll get this out of the way here and then we'll talk about all the great aspects of it. But it is just something, it hurts the last half hour of this movie for me because the last half hour, if you take that scene out, like if I went back and I did what George Lucas did and I just chopped that one scene out and just watched the rest of the movie, I have no complaints. And it seems ridiculous to complain about a movie when it has one bad scene but when it's as impactful as that, it's hard to disregard it.
No, absolutely. I totally get that. Especially, it must be even more frustrating with how short this scene is too.
It's so short. It's like 40 seconds. It's like, why?
Yeah. Yeah, it's literally like a minute tops. Easy to cut out. You just have that flashback to the clock tower where you see what happens, and then you proceed from there. But I don't know. We still need something. Like, if we're cutting this scene, get away from your cat. If we're cutting this scene, we still need something to say why Judy is willing to put up with all this, right?
Yeah.
Like, because we're still, like you said, we see it. We see her willingness to put up with Scotty's obsession, but we don't have any idea as to what that motivation is. Because if we don't have her literally proclaiming her love here, it doesn't make sense once we find out about the switch. So, like, is it the most eloquent way of presenting that? No. But is it still presenting something that's necessary for our understanding of what follows it? I do think so.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be curious. Like, one day when I'm more important than I am, I'll make a Phil Wood cut of the movie and I'll sell that for millions, and people will love it. And that's all. I'm gonna get Adobe Premiere and cut that one little snippet, and that's it. And I'm just kidding, FCC or whoever's gonna come after me for this, FBI, all of you. I'm joking. It's a joke. But yeah, but the great aspects of this movie, the setup is phenomenal. I mean, the tension just keeps going, because at the beginning you're like, what is he talking about? Like, she doesn't know who she is. And it just sucks you in to the point where you're like, why would I not believe that this woman actually thinks she's this other woman?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they set it up so perfectly where the husband, Gavin, doesn't tell you anything really. It's like, he like puts you on the right track so you know where you're coming to, but he completely allows Scotty to come up with his own conclusions. Right? It's like, okay, so he's following her. He sees Carlotta's grave. He sees the portrait of Carlotta. They go to the hotel, or like the house, the old house and everything. And he pieces it together. He does his own research to figure out who Carlotta is. Then Gavin comes and fills in the holes a little. He's like, yeah, Carlotta, she's related to her and everything. Build off that. Then we get the scene in the bay, which is absolutely astonishing. Like, Kim Novak just diving into the bay, Jimmy Stewart going after her. Phenomenal, because it's at that moment where you can feel the connection between these characters, right? You can feel that this voyeurism that Hitchcock likes so much is really like coming to fruition here, and it's crossing over into actual contact, which is something that, isn't really supposed to happen, right? Scotty's not supposed to have any contact with this woman because she's not supposed to know. And you think about it, that's why she has to dive into the bay, though, because Scotty has to have contact with her in order for this plan to work.
Yeah.
It's so brilliantly executed. It's so well set up.
And when she does that, you're like, wow, she's committing suicide at the San Francisco Bay, which is where they were claiming Carlotta Waters like disappeared or something anyway, right? At that point, like something happened. And so for that to be a plot point and have her do that, but really it's just a device being used. The character, and I don't remember his name because I've only seen this movie a handful of times, but the character who actually sets this plot in motion, the husband, such an underrated character because he's a criminal mastermind. I mean, it's a masterful plot and it's a great plot. And I think that's what, again, like gets me so much because Hitchcock, if you go back and go through some of his filmography, which I've watched a lot of Hitchcock in the last 2 years or so, what you start to realize is there are a lot of jumps in logic with Hitchcock where you have to kind of go along with it. Psycho, I don't think has that. North by Northwest is obviously just like so over the top, but it's such a great time. Rebecca doesn't really have that, but like there's these jumps in logic that you have to make. And this is such a perfectly constructed story. It's such a perfectly constructed story from beginning to end. Like you knew where every single thing was going to go. And that's what makes it so much fun. And you see the inspiration in a movie like Chinatown that came out 16 years after this, where there's not two women. Even though the whole movie, JJ Gittes thinks there's two women. There's only the one woman. Who's the daughter? Who's this? Or not the whole movie, but eventually he starts to figure out what is going on here. And she's the same person. And that's kind of like the reverse of this. But I love the plotting of this. And for her to jump in, and then when you rewatch it, you're like, that was all part of the plan. Like, that's the greatness of the screenplay for this. And that's like what's so much fun about it. And why it continues to, just be one of those movies that people constantly revisit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's also coupled with these great visuals. Like, there are some visuals in this movie that you kind of forget about, but like there's the dream sequence right after.
The sequence was so good.
Yeah, right after she dies, and you have the dream sequence with the animation and everything, the going through, and like the focusing on Carlotta's necklace. Hitchcock does such a good job of not only showing us Scotty's like descent into psychosis, but also setting up this trigger that's going to break him out of it at the end of the film and cause his literal worst fear to actually come true.
Yeah. Yeah. And like this, the other stuff in this, the techniques that were used, like Jaws uses it 17 years later with the Roy Scheider shot, which I always talk about as like, whoa, that moment. This was doing that, but making it like that creation of space. We'd never seen anything like that up to this point. And so like those techniques and those visuals added on to the dream sequence and those visuals and like those types of moments to put animation into a movie that was a serious movie. And it was Alfred Hitchcock was not the rage in 1958. I know The Incredible Mr. Limpet existed by this point. No, it didn't. The Incredible Mr. Limpet didn't come out till 64. So there was no reason for animation to show up in a serious movie. I mean, I had to convince my dad in like 2004 that animation should be taken seriously. And he'd been alive. He wasn't even alive during Vertigo. He was born after Vertigo came out. So to do that is so risky. And yet it is one of the most memorable scenes of the entire movie.
Yeah, it was just it was a risk. And like that's what makes Hitchcock, and that's part of what makes Hitchcock Hitchcock, though, right? His willingness to risk. I mean, even when we talk about Psycho, he was willing to show a toilet and like have a toilet flush, right? Like those type of things weren't happening when Hitchcock was making movies, and he was so at the forefront of film creation at this time. Yeah, he wasn't heralded as much as someone like Orson Welles was at the time, but like he was still making these movies in such a way that they have impacted everything that has come after them.
Yeah, and like you start to look at like who was really like the hot one around this time. It was like Billy Wilder was probably that was really the guy. And I mean, Billy Wilder,
I mean, to be fair, one of the best directors ever.
Yeah, all time. And the next year he makes Some Like It Hot, or 2 years later, whatever year Some Like It Hot came out. But yeah, I mean, like Vertigo and Hitchcock, it's funny because with artists, right? Like Hitchcock, Kubrick, they have a couple box office successes, but not very many. We were talking about Paul Thomas Anderson last week or 2 weeks ago, whatever it was. David Fincher. Like, there's a lot of phenomenal directors who are part of like the culture that are household names that just don't have that box office success with that many of their movies. And Vertigo was a total failure. But Vertigo at this point is considered one of the greatest movies of all time and is probably one of the most influential movies ever made. Because before this movie, it was a lot of put the camera down and do your normal two shot. Like that's really what was happening. I mean, I've been watching a lot of older movies, and the one thing you notice when you watch older movies, a lot of the shots are wide. And it's two people talking. You're not really getting facial expressions, and like you feel distant from the actors. And Vertigo, and in the 50s, they started to change that. But Vertigo really said, look, there are things we can do with the camera that can make film even more visually interesting. And we see, I mean, Jimmy Stewart's head in front of the spiraling thing should not work as well as it does. And it's freaking awesome. So yeah. And then that's set against the stunning visual of her jumping into the bay with the Golden Gate Bridge above her. I mean, yeah, there's a lot to be impressed with when watching this.
Yeah, and I mean, there are other parts of this film that are so well done too. I mean, I think Bernard Herrmann's score,
It's
it's
so
an
good.
it's an underappreciated score. It's not one that's mentioned a lot, but it does such a good job of capturing that essence of Vertigo. And like
Mhm.
I mean like the sensation of Vertigo here, not the film, obviously, but like that dizzying effect of the score at times. It's so well done. It's helps build the suspense. It's a beautiful score that's really subtle in this film, and it kind of takes a back seat to everything else that's happening, but
Mhm.
it really elevates everything that's happening as well.
Yeah. It's a really good score. I mean, it's one of those that doesn't really get talked about. It's not like, the Psycho score is the Hitchcock
Hmm.
score that always gets talked about, but this is a phenomenal score. It's just it doesn't get discussed, and that's interesting because with everything great in the movie, the thing with Vertigo is I feel like a lot of people don't know what Vertigo is about when they sit down to
Yeah,
watch it. Like Citizen
yeah.
Kane, a lot of people know like the whole thing with whatever his name is at this point, Hearst or whoever, whatever
Mhm.
his full name, William Randolph Hearst. A lot of people know that that's like the backstory of it and all of that. Everybody knows what The Godfather's about and Casablanca and Gone with the Wind and Wizard of Oz and The Graduate. Like you all know what these movies are about. The one outlier, if you go look at AFI's top 10 or BFI's top 10, is Vertigo. People don't really know what it's about. And it is kind of a hard movie to explain because while the mystery is phenomenal, it is about so much more than that with just
Mhm.
like, like the human elements and like what's real, what's not. And like these were things that weren't being seen in the 50s. We weren't seeing guys be kind of taken for a ride like Jimmy Stewart's taken for in this one. They always seem to come out, pretty masculine at the end of the movie.
Mhm.
Jimmy Stewart doesn't really come out masculine at the end of this movie. Like, if you know what I mean, like by the
Yeah,
1950s definition of masculine.
yeah. I mean, he comes out looking like the bad guy at the end of this movie,
Yeah.
right? That his obsession causes the death of Judy at the end of this film because he's so obsessed. As soon as he sees that, like Carlotta's necklace again, he gets so obsessed. He takes her back, and then the nun shows up, which spooks Judy, and she ends up falling. And it's the recreation of everything. The whole movie is about the guilt that Scotty feels for letting that officer die at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's
Mm-hmm.
called Vertigo. It's about Vertigo because I mean we haven't even discussed the fact that like Scotty is specifically chosen for this scheme because Gavin knew that he couldn't make it up that tower.
Yeah. Yep. That's
And
the only reason he chose him. Yep.
yeah, and yes, Vertigo is like this key plot point that allows this plot to get like to happen. It's not what the movie's about. The movie is about this guilt that he has associated with it. He's trying to get back to it, right? He's retired police officer. He's not going back to the force after he finds out about his vertigo, after he's injured. He doesn't want to go back to the force. He doesn't want to be a police officer, but he's pulled back in by an old college friend who asked him to do a favor. And
Mm-hmm.
he's there's so many little things in this plotting of this film, the little details that add to the whole scope that if you stop paying attention for like a minute, you might lose what this movie's about. And it is about that human obsession. It's about human obsession, not just with, you know, falling in love with someone. I think that that's in place of this guilt, right? He's falling in love with this woman because he saved her. It's
Mm-hmm.
it's it's
Mm-hmm.
that redemption, and then when he loses her, he goes completely off the deep end. It's so incredible. It's just so well written.
And I know you're like a big Palahniuk fan.
Mhm.
Like when he did Choke. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a book that comes out in 2003 or four or whatever it was. And that's all about kind of the same thing, right? Where he gets people to give him money because they save his life. So that
Mhm.
makes them feel purposeful. It makes them feel important. And what happens in this movie is Jimmy Stewart, who is a detective and is well respected, allows a man to die, and now he needs to find purpose again. And
Mhm.
so he finds this woman who he thinks he can save. And when she dies, he's so obsessed with it because that's the second time it has happened to him.
Yeah.
And so that's and it's it and what is it that caused these people to die? At least what he thinks is his weakness.
Mhm.
He sees it as his weakness is why these people died. And that's really powerful stuff. So it's a damn
Yeah.
shame that she wrote that stupid freaking letter.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about one of the best scenes in the movie then. Let's talk about this scene in the redwood forest
Yeah, the Redwood Forest is great.
because we've actually had an opportunity. There was a movie that we talked about in our top 100 already that had this scene in it. Do you remember that?
No.
This is in 12 Monkeys. In 12 Monkeys, when they go to the
Mm,
cinema, this is the scene that's playing there. It has to
interesting.
do with like the, this is where I was born, this is when I died thing of it all.
Mhm.
But this is the moment where Judy, as Madeline, really pulls in Scotty, right? Like this is
Yeah.
right before they actually profess their love for each other, right before they kiss for the first time. This is that moment where the lie becomes reality. And it is so wonderfully acted. It's
Mhm.
so there's this ethereal feeling to the forest because it's an ancient, right? It's so much older than everything. And when we're talking about the past, when we're at the point where at this point we 100% believe, okay, Madeline is being possessed by
Mhm.
Carlotta.
Mhm.
Like you 100% believe that there. And this is the scene that really confirms it, right? This is where I was born. This is where I died. And then she just walks off towards the ocean.
Now, have you seen Rebecca?
I have not.
Okay, so this is where it really helps when you get into Hitchcock's history, right? Because Hitchcock
Mhm.
is allowed to set up the expectation with his previous work.
Yeah.
And in Rebecca, there's a lot of the same kind of theming behind like the woman who thinks she's
Mhm.
like, become it's got that like persona thing kind of going on, right? The film is here, just to give you this. The film is a gothic tale shot in black and white. Maxim de Winter's first wife, Rebecca, who died before the events of the film, is never seen. Her reputation and recollections of her, however, are constant presence in the lives of Maxim, his new wife, and the creepy housekeeper.
Right.
So it's like Rebecca is just an obsession for
Mhm.
the woman. And the way it plays in Rebecca, I didn't spoil anything there. The way it plays in Rebecca is phenomenal, similarly to what Vertigo does, which
Yeah.
so it allows for that. But the Redwood Forest scene is great with those elements.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, get your last moments in.
Okay, before I get before we end, I would be remiss. Man, the guy who leads this tribunal was a dick.
Wait, what
The tribunal,
tribunal?
the tribunal
Oh,
that happens
yeah.
right after Madeline dies. Man, this guy just like leans into Scotty so hard, and it's so good that he does because Hitchcock is once again trying to confuse us as an audience. So then when Gavin comes over and be like, "Yo, Scotty, it's not your
Yeah.
fault," you don't even suspect that it's because he just
Mhm.
murdered his wife.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally agree. And in 1950s, people kind of would be dicks to somebody who they like
Yeah,
thought like your weakness is why this woman's dead. Thanks a lot.
yeah,
No, that scene's great. I had a lot of fun watching that, being like, this is what it was like in 1958, huh?
yeah.
Um, but yeah, Vertigo's a must watch. Just be
Mhm.
prepared for the damn letter scene, and you'll be happier to know it's there. Because I didn't know it was coming the first time I watched it, and I was like, oof. But all right, let's jump into what was the best thing you watched this week? Did you watch anything?
I watched one. I got one in today. I
Okay.
watched Stagecoach today, which is really
Okay.
interesting with how we were talking about like Vertigo and like 24 years prior because it came up 20 years before Vertigo, right? And that's exactly how I felt about that movie. Is
Mhm.
it's a good movie. It's an enjoyable movie. It's a good Western. It has all those Western tropes. It kind of sets up all the Western tropes, like
Mhm.
for everything that comes after it. John Ford, John Wayne, and all I could think the entire movie was like, man, this is a good movie, but it feels like it's missing something. And it feels like the technology just wasn't there for
Wasn't
John
there.
Ford to really reach his vision.
Well, it's funny because my favorite movie of the week was also a John Ford, and it came out before Stagecoach, and it's called The Informer. And it's a
Mhm.
movie though where the whole premise of the movie is it's Ireland and Britain. You have the
Yeah.
Irish Republican Army in 1922, and the Brits are over, who are controlling them. And it's about an Irish guy who informs on his friend to make some money.
Yeah.
And the entire movie is just about his guilt. And he just walks around and he feels the guilt for an hour and a half. And it is dark. For a movie from 1935, that's not a horror movie. I was like, oh my God. I watched it right after I watched Eternal Sunshine, thinking, like, oh, this will be nice.
Yeah.
1935. Dude, it holds up. It's really good. Victor McLaughlin, who plays the lead, is great in it. I was really impressed, and I think it's better than Stagecoach. I was with you. I gave Stagecoach 3 stars when I watched it. It just wasn't there.
Mhm.
But I do want to give quick shout outs to other ones, and I'm not going to harp on these, but I just want to say I also watched Goldfinger, which is still a 4-star movie. Mrs. Miniver is great. If you haven't watched Mrs. Miniver, check out Mrs. Miniver. It won Best Picture in 1942. That's why I watched it. It is so underrated. Nobody ever talks about it. It's a really good movie. Chariots of Fire aged like shit. Land Before Time, I rewatched to make my childhood feel important. And then I was on a plane today for 5.5 hours. So I watched Chicken Run and Uncharted. People were way too hard on Uncharted, man. You hated Uncharted. People were way too hard on that movie. It's pure nonsense, but who cares?
No, my concerns with Uncharted was it wasn't an Uncharted movie. It was just a movie that was named Uncharted, and it wasn't actually Uncharted. That was my complaints about that movie.
I think because I even wrote that in my review, because I'm so removed from the video games at this point, it doesn't bother me that Mark Wahlberg plays Sully, even though they could not have cast a worse person to play Sully. And Chicken Run is still very entertaining. That one's still a fun hour and 25-minute watch. But
I will say your review though for The Land Before Time this week is my favorite Letterboxd review of all time.
Dude, she is such a miserable person. Like, I hate her. At one point I was like, I hope they call it the sharp tooth. I was like, will the sharp tooth just eat her? Like, please. There is no sympathy for this character. Her whole family is racist. She's a racist. She's going to grow up to become a worse racist. She is mean to everybody. She is a sourpuss the whole time. I was rooting for the sharp tooth to rip her to shreds the whole movie.
And it was just so funny because I just read it. I'm like, why is Sarah smiling? I was like, this is perfect review.
Thank you, John. Well, I appreciate that. Sometimes what brevity is the soul of wit. But so let's jump over to Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. And let's talk about what's my number 3. And you had it in your 70s.
70s? I don't know why. It should be much higher than that. This is like, we're talking at least top 20.
Like, so Eternal Sunshine is an interesting one for me, right? Because this came out in 2004. I was too young to know what the hell was going on when my parents rented this from Blockbuster. I had no idea. And this was coming on the heels of Adaptation, which I infamously told my parents to turn off the first time they had it. I don't know why you would have a 10-year-old try to watch Adaptation, but they did. And my parents didn't like it because it was too weird for them. And then Eternal Sunshine came out. My parents didn't like it again. And it was kind of removed. And then kind of like with Amelie, right? When I was in high school, that teacher said, what's your favorite movies of the decade? And Eternal Sunshine he talked about Eternal Sunshine. And then when that was happening and I was really getting into film, Eternal Sunshine was constantly coming up. So I said, I have to rewatch this movie. And I watched it and it blew my mind. Like in 2009, 2008, whatever year I watched it, it blew my mind. And then I watched it again and again and again and again and again. And I've probably seen this movie close to 30 times and it still hits me just as hard every single time. Every character too. I just need to say that. I really like you, Mary Svivo. Kills me. Like, it's so pathetic, but it's what the heart of this movie is, which is what do we want to live with and what do we not want to live with? And what Charlie Kaufman did with this screenplay, where he tells it in reverse, right? Because we always get the cliche of they have their meet cute, they fall in love, and then they fall out of love and they get back together. And every relationship, right? Like, you forget at the beginning, it's great. Everything's amazing. You want to tell all your friends, you want to scream it from the mountaintops. And then whenever it ends poorly, it's because something happened and you totally forget about that other stuff doesn't matter as much as what happened here. So to tell this backwards and do all the bad stuff first and then get into the good moments and be like, but I want to keep this memory. And it's the memories you have forgotten about anyway, right? Like, it's all the stuff you always remember how you first met, but it's that stuff in between that you have forgotten because you're dwelling on the negative, which is what made this happen anyway. And the humanity of this movie, there might not be a more human movie ever made. And Charlie Kaufman fell off big time after this movie. I mean, he never came close, in my opinion. Synecdoche, New York is what it is. And then Anomalisa is good. But with Being John Malkovich, Adaptation, and Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, Charlie Kaufman nailed what it's like to be in somebody's head. And while everybody will say, like, Being John Malkovich is like what it's like, oh, you're in somebody's head, this movie is the ultimate, oh my God, we're in somebody's head the entire movie. And when they're being erased and he's seeing it again and he's doing the conversation and Then all of a sudden he starts having conversation with Merzwiak, who's sitting in there with him. It is so brilliant. I think it's the greatest screenplay ever written. I've said that for years now, and I firmly believe this is the best screenplay ever written. I don't know how he pulled it off. It completely changed the game in terms of like Fight Club kind of had like the manic pixie dream girl first, but everybody wanted to be or date a Clementine Krasinski after this. Don't ask me why, but that's what everybody wanted. I guess they didn't get really the message of the movie, which is like, that like, well, love can conquer all, but also like, maybe sometimes it is like kind of crazy, but also this whole, just the visuals, what Michel Gondry does with this. And it's crazy because he never came close to this again either. Michel Gondry's visuals in this movie are impeccable. The direction is impeccable. The screenplay is impeccable. Kate Winslet is 10 out of 10. One of the best performances ever. Jim Carrey is so subdued, which is so against type for him. The score, the soundtrack, that it features a lot of Beck and all of that. David Cross and Jane Addams are fantastic in their little small roles. And then obviously Kirsten Dunst, Tom Wilkinson, Mark Ruffalo, Elijah Wood, they all knock it out of the park. Mm-hmm. And this movie leaves you just being like, oh my God, every single time. Because when they're running on the beach in the snow, you're like, is this after? Is this a memory? And it just keeps replaying it and replaying it. Like it's on skip. It's too good. But anyway, John, I'll let you talk because I know it's in your top 100, and then I'm going to talk about all the greats.
This is a movie that it had been a while since I had watched Eternal Sunshine, which is I'm just trying to justify that I had it so low on my top 100. It was a mistake. Okay, I'll admit it. It was a mistake. It had been a long time, and I actually had the same response to it the first time I watched it. I first watched this movie in 2011. A friend of mine showed it to me, and then I immediately showed it to more friends the next day. Mm-hmm. Like, that's the type of movie this is, where you sit down and you watch it and it's emotionally devastating. It wrecks you. The older I get, the more this movie hurts to watch. And you still want to show it to people because it's like, this is just like one of the best movies ever made. It's a pinnacle of filmmaking. Like you said, Michel Gondry's visuals in this film, absolutely stunning. They evoke so many emotions as you're watching this movie. And I can't get over Jim Carrey's performance in this movie.
Yeah.
When you think about what Jim Carrey has done other than this, like, there's no question in my mind this is the best performance he's ever done. It is so phenomenal. And casting someone like Jim Carrey, who at this point, I mean, it's 2004, right? He's done all of his 90s comedies already, right? Mm-hmm. You are used to slapstick Jim Carrey, over the top, crazy. You're used to him being an eccentric character, and to have him as the boring everyday guy, like, it's such a perfect casting, and it still holds up all these years later, even if you don't know what Jim Carrey's reputation was at the time of making of this movie was.
And I think what's funny is because of how this movie has aged, this is what people think of with Jim Carrey. We might not think that. We might think a little bit differently because we were around when Ace Ventura came out. We were around when The Mask came out, even though we were infants. We were around when these movies were being played all the time. Batman Forever and Me, Myself, and Irene and The Truman Show and Bruce Almighty, like all of these. But because 90s comedies haven't aged that well, it's actually worked to the benefit of Jim Carrey because the movies that people talk about now with Jim Carrey are The Truman Show and Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. And of course, they talk about how The Grinch Stole Christmas, which you could say what you want about the movie. He's phenomenal in it. And I think it's a perfectly good, what do you call Christmas movie?
Yeah.
But that works for him. It works so well. And it was shocking for people like us, but it was also only 5 years after he was Andy Kaufman in Man on the Moon, where Milos Forman killed it with Jim Carrey. So, but there's something about this. And also to start it off at the end, because we end up finding out that it's the end, Jim Carrey in bed, whatever, and he just starts narrating in this super monotone, depressed voice. And you're like, what the hell is this? Like, who is this guy? Because for those of us who did know his reputation, like, who is this? I mean, look at The Mask and look what his jaw does the entire movie. This isn't that guy. And to start it and have this be so basic, he decides to skip work today. He goes out to Montauk. He doesn't remember ripping pages out. Sand is overrated. All these nonsense thoughts that go through a brain. Sees this girl. Why do I fall in love with every girl who shows me even the smallest bit of affection?
Oh,
Boom, boom, boom. Yeah, it's brilliant, right? And then he looks down. She pours it in. They have the train scene. Picks her up. We are 20 minutes into this movie when Elijah Wood knocks on the window and says, "Can I help you?" And you're like, up until that moment, you're like, this is a normal relationship movie. They meet cute. They get in the car. They're going to have a good time. Oh, you said I do. That means we're married. Like, oh, this is cute, whatever. And then Elijah Wood knocks. And all of a sudden you go, okay, something's off. Now, even if you didn't know the premise of the movie, you realize something's not right here. And it starts the opening credits 22 minutes into the movie. And it's him sobbing, going into the house, and the two guys in the van pulling up and saying, there's that guy. And you're like, why are they mocking him? What's going on?
Yeah.
That setup to do it that way and tell the story so it's so normal. And then after those first 20 minutes, it is nothing but batshit crazy. I don't know how he pulled it off. I seriously have no idea how he pulled that off.
Yeah, it's just the collaboration between Charlie Kaufman and Michel Gondry on this it's astounding, because I actually luckily had the opportunity. I showed this to my roommate when I watched it this week, who had never seen it before.
Mm-hmm.
Never seen it before. And he's watching this meet cute and everything. And he's like really happy. He's like, oh, this is so endearing. It's so sweet. Yeah. Cut to Jim Carrey crying in that car. He's like, no, don't do this. And it's like, oh yeah, you thought that was the movie? That was just the prologue to the movie. Mm-hmm. We're just getting started. And it's so fun watching someone who's never seen this movie before piece everything together. Mm-hmm. Because it gets to the point where Joel is in the office and just explaining how he met Clementine. And my roommate's like, that's not how they met. We just saw how they met. They met on the train.
Yeah.
And it's like, and I'm like sitting there with this like little smirk on my face. It's like, oh, you don't even know what's going to happen. And we're just watching it go again. And as we progress through the movie, he had that moment of realization when, they're the hints. Everything's set up so perfectly.
David Cross talks about it at one point, or somebody says something about it. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, everything's little there. You see the fight with Clementine crashing the car into the fire hydrant, leaving the mark on the car that he's already found that morning that he didn't seem to know about. And it's like, everything adds up. And like, there's that moment at the very end where it cuts back to the beginning again. And my roommate has that realization of, oh my God, this is the greatest screenplay ever written.
Yeah. It's ridiculous. And I mean, like, I think about when you talk about this, like how they met. So I went to a screening of this on Valentine's Day when I was living in North Hollywood at the Lemley. Yeah. Okay. And they did a Q&A, like not a Q&A, but like they did like a question thing, like trivia thing at the beginning so you could win prizes. And the question was, how did they first meet? And some asshole raised his hand before me, so he got to answer first. And he said they met on the train. And thankfully my hand was still up. And then they were like, no, that's not right. What about you? And he points at me and I said, they meet on the steps at the beach. He takes a piece of his chicken and he's like, you just took it. And I remember the guy goes, well, now that you just spoiled that for everybody. And I was like, well, don't ask the question. But I gave such a detailed thing. So I got a DVD of the movie. I got like free popcorn, free tickets to that place. And I got a beanie that I can't find. And I really wanted to find it and wear. But then we got lost in the shuffle of flying out to Arizona. But there's an Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind beanie that I have that says it, that I never wear because it makes my head look absolutely gigantic, even though it's already big. But it is this thing, right? Of they tell you how they meet right away. And then as the movie goes on, they say, we met at the bar. You guys met at the beach party or whatever. And you're like, what? Like there's these little mentions of it that you're like, what are you talking about? That's not how you met. You met at the beach, but you didn't meet at a party. That didn't happen. And as it starts working its way backwards, you're like, you start to realize, oh, we didn't see them meet for the first time. And it gets to, now I always overuse this and so I have to like be really careful, but you have the scene in the house might be the most emotional scene ever put on film.
Yeah.
And I get, like I always say, the greatest, whatever, and we're gonna get to the deer hunter with the Russian roulette scene, and I just can't wait to talk about that because I don't think anything's ever built tension better than that scene. So sorry, John, to spoil that. But this house falling apart when you realize it's their first memory together, but it's
Mhm.
the last memory together now. It's the last one that they have left after they tried so hard to keep something. And it's what if I stayed? What if I stayed? And the emotion, I'm getting chills talking about it now, right? Like it's so
Yeah.
beautiful. And when she comes down the stairs and she just says, "Meet me in Montauk," like the brilliance of that. So now it has come full circle of that's why he goes to Montauk. That's why he skips work. That's why he's doing this. The impact of those 4 words, "Meet me in Montauk," man, it's just beautiful. It's so beautiful, and unpack that emotional punch, and then he's driving home, and who was that I saw? You talking to somebody pretty? Oh, it's just a girl. It's just a girl. And then it's beep, and it's just Mark Ruffalo and Tom Wilkinson going, "Well, that's done. Thanks, he's done." And you're like, it's gone. But you
Yeah.
also know that the Meet Me in Montauk happened, and rather than replay that whole thing, now we catch up with them picking up the Lacuna letter from Kirsten Dunst, who's telling them, "You all had each other erased from your memories, and here's how you really feel about these people." Because it has to end on that note. It has to end on the note of, can we start over, or are we eventually going to fall into the same traps? I love that.
Well, that's the big question that this film's asking, right? It's like, if you knew every relationship you had an expiry date, if you knew that every relationship you ever have is going to end terribly, horribly, you're not going to live out your entire life with someone, is it still worth having? That is the question this movie is posing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we close it with the only way to close this movie. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's just like, it's so powerful. It's so moving where it's like, we're looking at these memories, and it's really interesting because if you start dissecting this movie a lot, which I did, of course,
Mm-hmm.
you get this realization that the only times we ever actually see Clementine in this film is when she has blue hair. Those are the
Meaning in
only
real life.
moments. Those are
Everything
the
else is
only
in her
moments
head.
where it's
Yeah.
actually Clementine, and
Yeah.
everything else is inside Joel's head.
Mm-hmm.
Every interaction he is having with Clementine is either a memory or his subconscious interacting with him as Clementine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's where it really shows how much he like loved her, and how much the relationship is so meaningful to him, because there are these good times that they had together. There are these times where, you know, they want to work it out. They enjoyed each other's company so much. And then when we get to the fact that they both are in Montauk still, that we get Meet Me in Montauk, but it's subconscious from Joel. It insinuates that Clementine also had the subconscious drive
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
go to Montauk in order for this meeting to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, because it is being stated in Joel's mind.
Yeah.
But but it's like they're so connected that she's also what's driving her to Montauk. She's impulsive. We know that. Like
Mhm.
these are the types of things, and she's gonna go. And what I love about the opening too, right? Like you wouldn't make a joke about my name, Huckleberry Hound. No, I don't know that one. Oh my darling. Oh my. And then you're like, how does he not know that? Like everybody knows. Oh my darling Clementine. Like what are you talking about?
Yeah.
And to figure out why that's the case, because he had to literally erase every single thing that could possibly remind him of her. And yeah, for the fact that it's both of our subconscious somehow managed to actually like meet on this and figure out what to do. And like we know that she has erased him already.
Yeah.
But it's almost like what there's a part of her in his mind still. Like there's still like a part of her that is like, and we don't know what happened in the erasing of hers. Maybe there's a seed planted there where she says, we'll fix it all in Montauk. Like we don't know what happened in the erasing of hers.
There is an insinuation that something went wrong with that, the erasing of her, based on her behavior when Patrick goes and visits her.
Yeah.
It seems like, and like just like her erraticness on the phone, it's not the the Clementine we're kind of like used to at that point. It's a different type of erraticness
Mhm.
that makes it seem like, and I think it's really important that, of course, like, you know, Joel asked, is there a chance of brain damage? It's like, well, this is all brain damage. We're seeing the effects of that, right? It's set up really well. And just the fact that it breaks at the exact right time for Joel to go meet is very interesting. But I think it's kind of because Patrick was at Joel's apartment and then goes to see Clementine that it happens to line up, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and she's feeling like something's happening to her. Like she feels it's almost like she knows she erased the memories, but there's something where with Joel also erasing the memories, there's a connection that is being broken there where she's like, wait, something is happening, right? And I think that gets into like the reserved versus not reserved and all of that, where like he has a more reserved personality. So maybe he's not noticing because he doesn't notice when he's being erased from her mind. But she is so hyper aware of everything. She's so emotional. She's so impulsive. She's so all of these things that she has like that connection that is allowing her to feel this kind of happening to her. She feels like she's disappearing, right? And I love that because it's that feeling of there's something more to her that is happening in this. And I agree with you. I think something happened during her erasing that she was also saying, maybe I don't want to get rid of this because she's impulsive. And then she starts to realize I didn't want this to happen. And maybe she fought against it. So we don't know. There's not going to be an Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind 2. Hopefully they never remake the movie. Hopefully it just stays as what it is. But that's the fun of it, right? Like that's the fun and games of Eternal Sunshine is all of that stuff. And Joel is literally running through his mind with the memories of his ex-girlfriend as they're being erased. And he's trying to do everything he can to not have her be erased, but it's not really her that he's working with. Like, it's very fun.
Yeah. And I mean, it also really plays on the fact that like with Clementine feel like she's being erased, all we really are. Okay, we're about to get a little philosophical here. I'm sorry. Movie makes us do this though. All we really are the memories other people have of us. Right? Like, yeah, we get into the Descartes of it all. I think, therefore, I am. Yeah, that's how you are. But in a global scale, all you are the memories and the thoughts people have of you. And as those are being erased, it can feel like you disappearing, right? I think we'd all be lying to ourselves if we had never said we never had a moment where we thought, is anybody thinking about me right now? Right? And that's what Charlie Kaufman and Michel Gondry are really playing on in this film, is this idea that we are just memories. We are everything we have, everything we are, everything that defines us are memories. And if we forcibly remove them, that's why Mary's character arc in this movie is so important. Where Mary goes from like, I love what you're doing. I respect it so much. I think you're doing this wonderful thing for everyone, letting them forget these painful things, to when she realizes she had her memory wiped, and then she completely flips on it. It's like, no, never mind. This is monstrous what we are doing. This is terrible, and we need to remind everyone what they've forgotten. It's just such a deep dive into human psyche that should be impossible to put to film. But somehow here we are 19 years later still talking about it.
Well, it's the Modest Mouse song where he says, if life's not beautiful without the pain, I'd rather never ever see beauty again. Yeah. That's how a lot of people feel, right? Like if it's going to be painful, I don't want it to be beautiful, but you can't have one without having the opposite. Like I always like there always has to be an opposite for every feeling, for every emotion, for everything. Otherwise you don't have that. You can't love something without hating something. And it really gets into that where like when you go through these painful breakups, when you go through a divorce, John, as you've talked about on this podcast, when you go through just like terrible breakups with people you dated for years and you feel like that was going to be it. And then it's not. Like anything, fights with family, death of dogs, as we see in this with Buster, all of those things. Are you happy that it happened? Or do you need to have it removed? Like what would you be better off doing? And Joel and Clementine think that Clementine more so thinks she'd be better off if he just never existed, if they never knew each other. And then Joel decides, well, I can't live with the pain of her not knowing who I am, so I need to do the same thing. And it really gets into that. And it also gets into like, if we could do it over, would we make the same mistakes? And we see it where it's a yes. It's a, if we could do it all over without knowing, we'd go right back in, because Joel and Clementine have the same red flags that they had the first time they met on the beach. When Joel is scared because she's in the house and she breaks in and he's got to run away because he can't handle this. Those same red flags are there the second time that they meet for the first time. It's all there. Same thing with Mary Svavo and Howard. It's all there. But every time they go back to what they actually would want. Like they if you have that chance again, you would do it if you didn't know that it was going to work out poorly. And I think that's what's fun, like, about this movie. And I think that's what's so impactful about it on the culture. I mean, I don't know. It's a monumental movie. It really is just a monumental movie.
I think it's part of the reason why it plays so heavily on our generation and why people our age connect to this film so much. This is the movie that tells you, let go of regret and embrace the moment. Just embrace the time that you do have. Look back on the times you did have. Yes, they're going to be bad ones. Look at the good ones and cherish those. They've helped shape you into the person you are now. And just enjoy it. Enjoy life for the ride that it is. Because Michelle Gondry and Charlie Kaufman have gone on to say, Joel and Clementine continue going on, erasing each other and forgetting each other and re-coming back together over and over again for the rest of their lives. And
good.
Yeah, right? It's just like, they're just embracing that mentality of, yes, I am going to keep going on. I'm going to keep enjoying life. Even though I know this is going to end in disaster, I still want to experience it. And that's what makes us human. It's just the human condition explained so well and so beautifully. I mean, we've talked like a half hour straight at this point. We haven't even like really dived into these side characters at all. We haven't dived into other than saying that, like, you know, there's some spectacular visuals in this movie, because there are. We haven't dived into any of those because there's so much to impact in this film. Or unpack in this film.
Yeah, I mean, with everything disappearing, because it's literally being erased by a computer. And then when he goes to the memories that have nothing to do with Clementine, and his subconscious is still talking about Clementine, which is why they're able to find him in the memories, because he's thinking about Clementine now in a different scenario. And that's why they can find him in the bathtub or whatever it is, in the sink, or under the thing with the cookies. And like, those visuals are amazing. And that's when Jim Carrey gets to show off a little bit, right? Like, of what he's good at. But the visuals of the faces pretty much turning into the potato faces after we see all the potato heads throughout the entire movie and things like that. And the chaos of things disappearing and the lighting and all that. It's all brilliant. It's all fantastic. And one little thing that people don't really talk about, that I noticed a couple times ago, but I think is awesome. Nobody ever says anybody's names right in this movie. Have you noticed that? Miss Krasinski, and then he calls her Clementine Krasinski, and Merzwiak, and they call him Merzwak at one point. And like, those little things, Mary Svavo, and she says, and Mark Ruffalo calls her Svivo. Those little things are kind of interesting. Because it's like, in movies, they don't do that. But I think that is such a statement of how well do we know people, right? You can be in love with somebody and not have any idea how to say their name. Like, you know, if you have, you know what I mean? Like, if you have a really bad, we have a friend, one of my groomsmen, I was pronouncing his name wrong the entire time I knew him, his last name. And I still do, because you know what? That's your nickname now. That's what you're stuck with. But his last name, we all pronounced it wrong. And I remember one kid called him, said it the right way. And we were all like, dude, you said it wrong. And my friend was like, no, he said it right. And we were like, dude, we've known you for 20 years. And like, what are you talking about? Like, it was one of those. But that's the beauty of it, right? Like, those are the little details that Charlie Kaufman would get into. And he probably got a little too enraptured with after this movie. Cinedoche was a box office disaster and whatever. It's just, it was just on another level. And like, I don't know anybody our age who doesn't like this movie. I mean, it won the Oscar for Best Original Screenplay in 2004. So clearly people who are now in their 40s and 50s and 60s like it. There's no denying that. But I don't know anybody in our generation who sits down, watches Eternal Sunshine and is like, no, I don't like it. I feel like this was, I talked about how I thought The Royal Tenenbaums was like the definitive movie kind of the early 2000s. I think Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind is the definitive movie of the generation, like of
Yeah.
that whole era. I mean, if you're going to tell me that women weren't influenced by Clementine Krasinski and that guys weren't looking for one, you're out of your mind. I mean, you're out of your mind. That is a phase that everybody was going through at one time or another, because it was showing a deeply human people being weird and different and all of that. And that's what made them so compelling.
Yeah. And it was them being okay with being weird too, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, even when we get into, creepy Patrick here, who is like stealing his life and everything, like there's still this desperation in Patrick that you can really kind of like relate to, right? That feeling of like, oh, again, like it's that idea of like always chasing after a Clementine and wanting that type of girl. And Patrick's just someone who feels like he can't get that on his own, so he has to imitate someone else. And like we've seen that, we see that in life all the time. Yeah. It's just it's the little moments that Kaufman puts into these characters that really, really elevates them.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree. And like to see the falling apart relationships of Rob and whatever Jane Addams' character name is, like to see that, and like those things of like having these opposing relationships where they're not erasing each other, but you almost wonder, would they be better off if they did? That is what's fun with this, right? And with Patrick, you really see how skeevy and despicable everything that they're doing is. But at the same time, like Mark Ruffalo is not like a skeevy, despicable person. He's just kind of doing it, and it's whatever. And he's like a stoner guy who's just got a job.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, I'm thinking about it now. You can see the thought process on me now, and I know we want to wrap this up. I wonder if Patrick trying to emulate Joel is the reason why the erasure doesn't stick completely with Clementine. I wonder if it's that constant reminders, right? Or like even like Joel showing up at the bookstore and like that, and Patrick being there at that same time. I think it just like kind of creates those synapses inside Clementine's brain to like make it so that she's unsettled by everything.
It's all like, well, when Mierzwiak describes it as like a rough night of drinking, if you think really, really hard, you'll be able to remember things. Like they always say, like everything you've ever experienced is somewhere in your brain. It's just how do you find it? You have to really think about it. Did your brain actually register it? All of that. Maybe she lost it all and then it all came back because she is firing. That's a really good point. I really like that idea of he's starting to do so much of what Joel was doing, because those are when she gets the big reactions. When when she gets the present from him, when they go to the Charles and she sits up and is like, I need to get out of here. Like it's almost like it's sticking in her head.
Yeah.
And then it's okay, but how does she go to Montauk? I really do believe that part of that is whatever happened in her erasing, that was planted by her subconscious into Joel's subconscious somehow, some way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think they meet in Montauk anyway. So maybe it's just we're going back to Montauk because that's where it all started. And I don't remember why I'm going there, but something happened at Montauk because that is where they meet the first time anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think it's just those moments, those seminal moments in our lives always stick with us, even if we forget them.
Yep.
Like there are places that are just going to help you remind things, and you're going to not know why you're drawn to those places, but then you're going to get there and you'll be like, oh yeah, this is why I'm here.
Yeah, absolutely. So anyway, Eternal Sunshine, I mean, I could go on and you go on, and that's tough when you're splitting time between two movies. But Eternal Sunshine is just one of those, man, like you tell people you love the movie and like you don't like, there's always people who aren't going to like certain movies because everybody likes them. You're going to get those people who just like can't handle like, why would I remember I told somebody that like when they were like, what are your favorite movies? I said, American Beauty, The Deer Hunter, Amelie, Eternal Sunshine. Like I went through it, and her response was, oh, those are everybody's favorite movies. And I was like, well, they don't have the same reaction I do. And then it was like, so you don't like these movies because they're everybody's favorite movies? Like, and who is everybody? Because I don't think I've ever met anybody who loves The Deer Hunter as much as I do. So like, I just find those things to be funny, but Eternal Sunshine is never one of those movies that people are going to say, no, I don't like that.
Yeah.
Like it's not one of those movies. And there's something powerful about that. But anyway, that's all we got time for. We have 2 episodes left. That is it. And I guess we can kind of announce like what we're doing next, right? Even though we're not going to do it till July, should we just announce it? So in July, we're going to take a little bit of time off because with Survivor ending and with the movies ending, in July, I go to Europe, and then when I come back, which is the middle of the month, John and I talk about them all the time on this movie, and I speak in facts, even though I haven't seen most of them. John and I are going to do Marvel movies, but we're going to do all the Marvel movies in order. We're not doing the shows, so give me a break. I'm not going to deal with that shit. But we're going to do all the Marvel movies in order. But the second movie that we're going to do each week is going to be a movie that was released in theaters or is still in theaters or was released on Netflix or something like that. We did our top 100. You know how we feel. You've heard us talk about a lot of movies that maybe you haven't even heard of. You can always come back to this. You can always find this. We still are going to be talking a lot about Oscars. I'm sure we'll come up with other ideas throughout that we'll talk about different things, but that's going to get us like a solid 40 episodes. So we're going to go through all the Marvel movies, of which I think I've seen 4. So that'll be fun to go through them all. And we're going to talk in order about what they did and all that. And then the other half of each of those episodes is going to be a movie that is new, relevant. And this will also help John and I, because then we can actually keep up with the Oscar movies rather than trying to jam them all in January and February. So that's what we're going to be doing next. But obviously we still have 2 episodes of this left, and then that's not going to be till July. So it's about 2 months away. But next week we are talking about American Beauty and There Will Be Blood. There's only 2 movies named that, so I don't need to give you the years, but American Beauty and There Will Be Blood. Really excited for that one. I need to watch There Will Be Blood while I'm in Arizona so I can really get that desert feel. But anyway, thank you all for listening. Appreciate it. And we'll see you all next week.